the way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay?
Come on.
You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
Welcome fam, welcome fam. All right, once again, this is a marathon read. The California Reparations Task Force, Chapter 2, Enslavement. Yeah, this is going to be, unfortunately, a tragic read. But got to do it, man. Somebody's got to do it, right? So thanks, everybody, for joining. And let's get ready. I'm going to turn on little beats in the building so we can get this thing on and popping. Let's get this music started. All right, family. All right. Put a 1 in the chat and make sure that you can hear everything. Let me go to the board here. To it. This. If y'all see the screen, you put 1 chat. Y'all can see everything. Here. All right, cool. Let's let everything go. All right, let's on the big screen. All right, chapter 2 enslavement. And let's start. On July 5th, 1852, President Douglas the crowd of 100 most white activists in Rochester, New York. The day after Douglas was the most famous black anti-slavery began by praising the courage of the founders and gaining their freedom for them. Douglas did not come to celebrate their independence and the United States founded on the idea that all men are good people white Americans enslaved their fellow Americans and in turn hated all men whose skins are not colored. The 4th of July only highlighted the immeasurable between free white Americans and enslaved Africans. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. Rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers, shared by you, not me. Explain. You may rejoice. I must mourn. Frederick Douglass' speech about the 4th of July shows the conflict at the heart of American history. The United States prides itself on liberty, equality, and justice for all. But for over 400 years, white people have lived with ancestors built based on false notions of racial. White people at the top, people of African descent at the bottom, and all others rank. From the beginning, American wealth was built by the forced labor of people of African ancestry. These people were forced, sold, and traded as commodities for millions of cultivated crops, from sugar, rice, and the white wheat, corn, and especially cotton, that allowed American colonies in the early United States to prosper. Colonial governments in the United States and the U.S. government at all levels allowed them to participate in the exploitation, terror, and murder of people of African descent, so that white people could profit as much as possible from their enslavement. To justify stealing the intellect, skill, and labor of African Americans, the slavers created and spread false racist ideas that African Americans were less intelligent than whites, that they loved their children less than white parents, and that they felt less pain than white people did. Insisting that African Americans were less than human made it easier for enslavers and the American government at all levels to deny them the legal rights that many white Americans believed were a basic part of being American. After enslavement officially ended in 1865, white Americans terrorized African Americans with violence and racist ideas. African Americans lived under violent threats to themselves and their families and did not have the economic opportunities or political rights of their white peers. The laws allowing, promoting, and protecting enslavement, federal, state, and local governments were complicit in stealing centuries of unpaid wages from African Americans. The racist ideas invented to control enslaved people have echoed centuries of American laws and policies and physical, mental, and emotional trauma on approximately 16 generations of African Americans. The state and federal governments of this country have never atoned for these harms. This chapter traces a long arc of enslavement in early North America and the United States. Sections 3 and 4 examine the origins of race-based enslavement targeting people of African ancestry, the way slavery generated wealth for white colonists in English North America, and the emergence of transatlantic trafficking of enslaved African American people. Section 5 discusses the importance of enslavement to the founding of the United States, from the American Revolution to the creation of the United States Constitution. Section 6, 7, and 8 describe the lives of enslaved people during the height of the domestic slave trade, the complicity of Northerners in the perpetuation of enslavement, and enslavement's importance to American education, religious, and governmental institutions. Section 9 discusses the expansion of enslavement into Western U.S. territories, the South, and enslavement in California, and the complicity of the California state government in promoting enslavement, oppressive laws, and anti-Black sentiment. Finally, sections 10, 11, and 12 include the chapter by examining the U.S. Civil War, the formal abolition of enslavement, policies for formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. It ends by considering the lingering harmful effects of efforts to recast the defeat of the Confederate States of America into a, quote, lost cause and myth that endures to the present day. The origins of American enslavement, pre-modern enslavement. Enslavement has existed for thousands of years in many different cultures across the world. It's only in the past 400 to 500 years that white Europeans developed a type of enslavement based heavily on the color of someone's skin, and that mainly targeted people of African ancestry. This type of enslavement developed gradually between the 1400s and the 1700s. It was based on the ideas that African ancestry would be basis for lifelong enslavement, that the children of enslaved African-descended women could be enslaved from birth, and that people of African descent were naturally is destined to be enslaved. Before the 1400s, a time period known as the pre-modern era, enslavement and enslaved people differed widely. In the ancient Roman Empire, for instance, those who were enslaved were mostly conquered people who came from multiple racial, ethnic, religious, and class backgrounds across Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. In the Middle Ages, 1600s to 1400s, Celtic peoples, North Africans, Scandinavians, and especially Slavic people from Eastern Europe, from whom the word slave comes, were the most commonly enslaved groups in Europe. In the Muslim kingdoms of North Africa and the Middle East, both Slavic people and sub-Saharan African people, Africans who lived south of the Saharan desert, made up a large number of those who were enslaved. Enslaved people in these diverse societies became enslaved in different ways. They could be prisoners of war, kidnapping, targets of religious crusades, people sentenced to enslavement as a punishment for crimes, or poor people told to pay off debt. Depending on the culture or time period, children born to one or more enslaved parents were not always automatically enslaved, and it was fairly common for enslavers to free the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of enslaved people. Finally, early enslaved people fulfilled a variety of roles in their societies beyond being forced agricultural laborers or house servants. Enslaved people could be status symbols who represented the wealth and power of their enslavers, trusted advisors, poorly treated members of their enslavers, extended families, coerced sexual and marriage partners, or slave soldiers forced into military service. Into military service. Beginnings of modern enslavement. Enslavement changed with European world exploration and global colonization between the 1400s and the 1600s. In North America and South America, English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Dutch colonizers took indigenous peoples' land to grow crops such as sugar cane, tobacco, rice, and coffee, and to mine gold. In most of these new colonies, natural resources and land to grow crops were common, but laborers were scarce. In order to efficiently exploit these resources, Europeans first captured, enslaved, and exploited the indigenous peoples of North and South America. Because enslavement of indigenous people could not keep up with the demands of labor, European colonizers began to traffic enslaved people from the continent of Africa. Portuguese and Spanish colonizers brought the first enslaved Africans to North and South America to supplement forced indigenous labor. Portuguese merchants had been trafficking West Africans and selling them in Portugal for many years before the colonization of North and South America. It was these captives who were first forcibly moved in small groups to European colonies across the Atlantic Ocean. Portuguese and Spanish colonizers eventually started buying thousands of enslaved Africans along the coast of West Africa and Central Africa and bringing them directly to colonies in Caribbean and Brazil. Around 500,000 enslaved people of African descent had already arrived in North and South America, including Spanish settlements in present-day South Carolina by 1526 and Florida by 1539. By the time Dutch pirates sold around 20 African captives to English colonists in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Instead, European colonists who wanted to exploit enslaved black people and profit from their labor built this caste system gradually during the 1600s and 1700s. In the very earliest years, creating the American racial hierarchy. When these first Africans were brought by force to the English colonies that became the United States, the caste system based mostly on skin color did not yet fully exist. Instead, European colonists who wanted to exploit enslaved black people and profit from their labor built this caste system gradually during the 1600s and 1700s. In the very earliest years of English colonization in Virginia, European indentured servants were the most common workers. Indentured servants, usually either poor people who agreed to work for wealthy people for several years in exchange for transportation to the colonies, or they were people found guilty of crimes who had to work for several years in the colonies before getting their freedom. At first, there was not much difference between the treatment of enslaved Africans and European indentured servants. The major divisions in Virginia were between wealthy people and poor people who were forced to labor, not between black and white people. Wealthy white Virginians who controlled the colony and profited from the labor of both indentured white people and enslaved African people feared that rebellions by these lower class people might undermine their power and wealth. Wealthy white colonists attempted to solve this problem by using race as a way to divide these two groups and stay in power. Rich white Virginians began to grant more rights and privileges to poor white people. This move created a false sense of greater equality among rich and poor white English colonists, who began to come together around a shared idea that they were white people who were naturally superior to black people of African descent. The new unity between rich and poor white people in Virginia encouraged poor whites to keep Africans and their descendants enslaved and to help their wealthy neighbors quash rebellions of enslaved people. Colonial lawmakers then established new laws that made the racial caste system a permanent part of American culture and society. Colonial laws aimed to control people of African descent, kept them in lifelong enslavement, and kept poor whites and enslaved African descended people divided. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, these colonial laws gradually built up a legal system that treated people of African descent as permanent outsiders whose skin color made them naturally different from and unequal to all white people. These Virginia laws, called, quote, slave code, end quote, did the following. Made enslavement permanent and automatic for most people of African descent by saying the children born to enslaved mothers could be enslaved for life, that becoming a Christian were not in enslavement, and that enslavers did not set enslaved people free unless they paid to take them out of the Virginia colony. Made it easier for whites to control free people of African descent, those born into freedom or who did manage to escape enslavement, by denying them legal, political, and social rights. These included the right to vote, serve in colonial military organizations, have political office, or carry firearms, and divided all white people from all black people by making interracial sex or marriage a crime, punishing white women who gave birth to mixed-race children, and forcing these mixed-race children and their children into indentured servitude until they were 31 years old. Other southern colonies that depended on enslavement passed similar laws across the 1700s, sometimes copying the laws of Virginia directly. These early slave codes ensured that this racial caste system become widespread across much of the area that would later become the United States. Only after enslavement became widespread and profitable and racist policies were in place, did white people develop elaborate racist ideas to explain why the racial caste system was natural and good. European enslavers argued either that enslavement civilized Africans by introducing them to European climates and life ways, or that the Christian Bible had automatically cursed them to suffer enslavement. The overall goal of these racist ideas was to defend enslavement and white supremacy by claiming that black people were and always had been inferior to white people with European ancestry, the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved people, the growth of slavery. The search for profits, the unity of rich and poor white colonists, and the development of racist ideas paved the way for the massive increase of slaving voyages to Africa and the enslavement of people of African descent in the lands that would later become the United States. Enslavement of people of African descent played a major role in the population boom of English colonies in North America during the 1700s. Enslaved Africans and African descended peoples made up 47.5% of all people who arrived in the English colonies between 1700 and 1775. Around 278,400 of the 585,800 new arrivals documented during this period. This meant that transatlantic slave trade was nearly as important to the growth of English North America as free or indentured immigration from Europe. The populations of the English colonies showed this change. Between 1680 and 1750, people of African descent increased from 7% to 44% of the total population of Virginia, and from 17% to 61% of the total population of South Carolina. This trend was even more pronounced in the nearby British colonies of the Caribbean known as the West Indies, where almost 1 million enslaved Africans were forcibly brought during the same period of time, and where enslaved people made up 80 to 90% of the total population. To keep the profits of enslavement growing, British merchants, the British monarchy, and the British government worked together to become the leaders of the transatlantic slave trade. Just one English company, the Royal African Company, forcibly brought nearly 150,000 enslaved people from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean between the early 1670s and the early 1720s. This total was more than any single company in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. The English transatlantic slave trade of the 1600s to 1700s differed from the slave trades which existed in West Africa before or during the same period. Enslavement was common in sub-Saharan Africa, including West Africa, which in addition to Central Africa, was one of the main areas of the transatlantic slave trade. In West African societies, enslaved people were usually people captured in wars or attacks on another ethnic or lineage family ancestry groups, people who owed debts, or people found guilty of crimes. Enslaved people in West African societies also had a wide variety of social and economic roles. Many, especially children, lived in the same home as their enslavers and were treated as pawns, low-status members of the family group. Some worked in agriculture or as house servants, while some became wives or concubines, involuntary sexual partners, or secondary wives. This enslavement was not usually permanent or passed on to the next generation. Most enslaved people and their children in West Africa gradually lost their enslaved status and became part of the families and communities of their enslaved. The arrival of Europeans made enslavement along the western coast of Africa more widespread and violent. European enslavers depended on African slave trading networks for captives to send across the Atlantic Ocean. But the massive demand for African captives, which kept growing as Europeans colonized more areas of the world, changed African enslavement greatly. Warfare and kidnapping raids increased to capture more people to sell to Europeans. The focus of the West African slave trade also shifted to the coast and port cities where Europeans set up trading ports to buy people who had been captured. The transatlantic slave trade eventually involved capturing Africans from an enormous geographic area covering much of West Africa and Central Africa, and even extending to the island of Madagascar off the south coast of Africa. This trafficking in human beings spanned 3,500 miles along the western African coast from present-day Senegal in the north to present-day Angola in the south, and as many as 500 to 1,000 miles into the interior of the continent. Captive African people often changed hands many times and traveled long distances before they arrived at coastal ports where Europeans bought them. The Middle Passage. African captives suffered horrific physical, emotional, and mental trauma before and during the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. This journey was called the Middle Passage, and it was so dangerous, unhealthy, and violent that almost 1.8 million people died before they ever reached the Americas. Enslaved Africans' suffering began even before the slave ships set sail for the Americas. Once European enslavers purchased people who had been captured from African enslavers, they incarcerated them for days, weeks, or even months until they were ready to sell. In the early years of the slave trade, European enslavers imprisoned enslaved people in large corrals called barracoons. The most common practice, however, was to incarcerate enslaved people on board the slave ships until it was time to sail for the Americas. During the journey across the Atlantic Ocean, enslaved Africans went through months of torture trapped inside slave ships. This voyage the voyage, which was called the Middle Passage because it was the second leg of a triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. It took 80 to 100 days, around 2.5 to 3 months or more in the early years of the trade, although new sailing technologies cut the length of the trip to 60 to 80 days in later years. Slaving ships came in many different sizes, but the average Royal African Company boat held around 330 enslaved people. African men, who made up around 2/3 of all those captured, spent almost all of the journey, 16 hours or more every day, laying down in specially constructed rooms inside the ships. Crews stripped them naked, chained them up, and forced them to lay down on their sides, or to lay head to feet, so that they could fit in as many people as possible. On English slave ships, each man had a space smaller than the size of a coffin. On ships with tight packing, captains added an extra platform so that men laid in 2 rows stacked on top of each other with only 2.5 feet of vertical space to lay down. Enslaved women and children, who were usually smaller in number, lived together in groups in small rooms inside the ship. Conditions inside slave ships were horrific and caused massive amounts of sickness and death. Hundreds of people were crowded together in the blazing heat and tossed back and forth with the ship's movement, especially during bad weather. Enslaved captive Olaudah Equiano, who served the Middle Passage, wrote that the closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. Captives did not have much fresh air, and their rooms were covered with human waste. Rats and insects swarmed around them. Low-quality food, as well as scarce water, led to widespread lack of nutrition and dehydration. Filthy conditions and poor nutrition caused waves of sickness, including scurvy, a lack of vitamins B and C, and bloody flux, amoebic diarrhea, or dysentery. Highly contagious diseases, especially smallpox, spread fast in the overcrowded spaces. Slave ships were filled with people who were very sick, dying, or dead. Enslaved Africans also suffered physical and sexual violence at the hands of ships' crews. Crew members moved people who had been captured to the top deck of the ship on a regular basis to force them to bathe and dance for exercise. They often raped and impregnated women and girls. Heavily armed crew members watched enslaved people carefully, and they threatened, beat, tortured, and sometimes killed them, especially if they resisted or rebelled. There is also evidence that ship crews threw sick enslaved people overboard to prevent them from spreading diseases to others and to claim insurance money for lost human cargo. In one especially brutal case in 1781, an English slave ship captain ordered his crew to throw 132 Africans overboard because he had run out of supplies, and his insurance company would only pay him if enslaved people drowned, not if they starved to death. During the worst storms, crews also tried to keep from sinking by throwing enslaved people overboard to decrease the weight of the ship. British insurance companies allowed this and paid ship captains for any human beings who their crews threw overboard to drown. The transatlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage had a sickening cost in human lives. European enslavers forced around 12.5 million enslaved Africans to cross the Atlantic Ocean between 1500 and 1866. More than 14% of these people, around 1.8 million in total, died of sickness, neglect, abuse, murder, or suicide. The men, women, and children who survived the Middle Passage were then sold to local slave traders, merchants, or owners of plantations and forced labor camps. When their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean finally ended in North America, South America, or the Caribbean, enslaved Africans suffered social death, which meant that they were now permanently separated from their home communities, cultures, and families. They were outsiders in an unfamiliar place surrounded by strangers with completely different cultures, religions, and languages. Enslaved Africans had to build new families, languages, cultures, and religious practices rooted both in the pre-colonial traditions of their homelands and the new cultures that they found in America. Slavery and the founding of the United States. Starting in the late 1600s, enslaved people and the institution of enslavement became increasingly important to the colonial societies of North America that would later become the United States. The Southern English colonies of North America, which eventually included Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, began trafficking more and more enslaved people as the 1700s went on. These colonies gradually built economies and societies that depended heavily on enslavement for growing cash crops to sell in international markets. In the colonies of the Upper South, including Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and North Carolina, enslaved people grew tobacco. Enslaved people in the low country and coastal plains of the Carolinas and Georgia grew rice and indigo, a plant for making blue dye. Enslavers who forced enslaved people to labor in agricultural production exploited not only their physical strength, but also their intellect, innovation, and skill. Growing rice and indigo, for instance, required skilled labor and knowledge of specialized techniques for successful production. In fact, rice and indigo growing was already highly developed along the western coast of Africa, and later the Caribbean, where people of African descent had already innovated several production techniques. Enslavers were eager to buy enslaved people who already had these specialized agricultural skills. Human trafficking in enslaved people was not limited to the southern colonies. Whites in northern colonies also trafficked enslaved people, and enslavement became a feature of life in every northern colony. In most New England colonies, enslavement was not a major institution, but in colonies farther south, such as New York, enslavement was often a part of daily life. For example, 1/5 of New York City's population was enslaved in 1746, making it the second largest slaveholding city in the 13 original English colonies behind only Charleston, South Carolina. By the time white English colonists began to complain about the mistreatment by the British government and began comparing their lack of rights in the British Empire to enslavement, the real enslavement of people of African descent was already well established in all 13 original British colonies. 500,000 enslaved Black people, who made up 20% of the entire colonial population, knew the real horrors and trauma of enslavement. The American Revolution. When white colonists declared their independence from Great Britain, they explained their actions by saying that the King of England and the British government had taken away their freedom and their rights as freeborn Englishmen. In the Declaration of Independence, Americans famously announced that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the same time, these same colonists bought and sold people of African descent who had no freedom and very rights. Let me read that again. At the same time, these same colonists bought and sold people of African descent who had no freedom and very few rights. Sounds a little hypocritical. Continue. People who opposed the American Revolution were quick to point out the hypocrisy of these words. Thomas Day, an Englishman who opposed enslavement, said that if there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot, signing resolutions of independence with the one hand and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves. Even white American colonists understood the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence. Abigail Adams, an opponent of enslavement from New England, the wife of John Adams, and a future First Lady of the United States, wondered just how strongly white colonists felt about human liberty when they were accustomed to deprive their fellow citizens of theirs. The founders of the United States, especially those who owned enslaved people and profited from enslavement, were well aware of these contradictions, and they tried to downplay them. They knew that enslavement made them and their independence movement look hypocritical, but they also wanted to continue to profit from the stolen labor of enslaved people. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, owned around 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. His original draft of the Declaration of Independence openly criticized the transatlantic slave trade, which he called a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty. But he blamed it almost all on King George III of England. Jefferson claimed that the king not only failed to stop the slave trade, but also that the king encouraged enslaved people to rise up and kill white colonists. Embarrassment over enslavement and the hope to keep making money from it was clear when the Continental Congress rejected this part of the Declaration and voted to remove it. Jefferson explained the rejection in his notes. Representatives from South Carolina and Georgia depended on enslavement and wanted to continue in the trafficking of humans. Men from the northern colonies were embarrassed by the criticism of the slave trade because they were highly involved in shipping enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The final version of the Declaration of Independence only mentioned enslavement indirectly, by claiming that King George III was trying to cause domestic insurrections, code words for rebellions by enslaved people in the colonies. The founders of the United States tried to dodge the issue of enslavement, but enslaved and free people of African descent would not let them. They tested the new nation's ideas of freedom during the American Revolution War, 1775 to 1783. Around 30,000 to 40,000 people, and maybe as many as 100,000 people, escaped their enslavement during the American Revolution. Virginia's colonial governor, John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, quickly took advantage of enslavement in the colonies by promising freedom to any enslaved man who fought for the British Army against the Americans. Some male freedom seekers did join the British Army, but large numbers died from smallpox during their service. Others, including many women and children, took advantage of wartime chaos to escape to areas where the British Army was strong. The massive number of freedom seekers greatly damaged enslavement in the lower southern states. For instance, around 30% of South Carolina's enslaved population left or died during the Revolution. Some states tried to solve this problem by promising freedom to enslaved men who fought on the side of the Americans. Other states recruited free black men to boost the size of the small American army, even though they were smaller in number than whites. Free black men were more likely to volunteer for military service and to serve longer than whites because they wanted both independence for the United States and greater rights for themselves. Overall, around 9,000 free or enslaved African American men served alongside white revolutionaries in integrated military units to fight for American independence. African Americans' struggles for freedom during the American Revolution led to the end of the enslavement in most of the northern states, where the enslaved population was small and local enslavement was less central to the economy. Enslaved people used the revolutionary ideals of freedom to convince northern judges and the general public to end enslavement. When enslaved people in Massachusetts sued for their freedom, the state courts decided that enslavement was against the state's new constitution, which said that all men are born free and equal. Enslavement ended there in 1783. Nearby, the state of Vermont approved a new constitution that outlawed enslavement completely in 1777. States farther south, such as New York and Pennsylvania, depended much more on enslavement and so passed gradual emancipation laws to cover enslavers' loss of profits. These laws required children born to enslaved mothers to go through a long indenture, up to 28 years, and then be set free. Southern states that profited the most from enslavement kept and rebuilt it, but the process looked different in the upper and lower South. States in the upper South, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, temporarily began to relax their laws against freeing enslaved people. Manumission, the legal process by which enslavers freed enslaved people or allowed them to save money and purchase their freedom, became more common. This was partly because the Revolutionary War had hurt the market for tobacco and made enslavement less profitable in the upper South. Revolutionary ideas about human freedom also motivated some of the manumission, although with limits. For instance, Virginian George Washington, leader of the Revolutionary Army and the first president of the United States, freed all of the people he enslaved, but only upon his death. Washington, however, was not the norm. Thomas Jefferson, the next slaveholder from Virginia to win the presidency, willingly freed only 10 of the 600 people who had enslaved over the course of his life. 4 of those 10 people were his own children, with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who he owned as his property and who he never freed. Jefferson's fellow white Southerners in the upper South increasingly stopped manumission when they found that selling surplus enslaved people to cotton growers in South Carolina and Georgia could be a profitable replacement for tobacco. Meanwhile, the lower or deep South states rebuilt their plantation economies by buying enslaved people from the upper South and trafficking in large numbers of enslaved Africans from the transatlantic slave trade. Overall, the American Revolution created a new nation that was increasingly divided into 3 regions: the North, where enslavement was immediately or gradually ended; the upper South, where older patterns of enslavement were changing; and the lower South, where enslavement remained an important and growing part of the economy. The new cotton economy and expansion of slavery. Instead of dying out after the American Revolution, enslavement became the economic lifeblood of the United States, North and South. After winning independence, the United States built one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world. Between the end of the American Revolution in 1783 and the start of the Civil War in 1861, roughly the length of one human lifetime, the enslaved population in the United States increased almost 5 times, from just under 650,000 enslaved individuals to almost 4 million enslaved people. Okay, I'm going to read that once again. Roughly the length of one human lifetime, the enslaved population of the United States increased almost 5 times, from just under 650,000 enslaved individuals to almost 4 million enslaved people. 2 major processes made this possible. First, new technologies for producing cotton increased the value of enslaved people's labor and encouraged expansion of enslavement into lands in the Deep South. Second, white Americans adopted a national constitution that protected enslavement and gave pro-slavery white Americans outsized political power in the federal government. This power allowed enslavers to increase the profits of enslavement and to enjoy those profits with little regulation by the federal government. Starting in the 1790s, new technologies made enslavement more profitable than ever in North America. A new machine, the cotton gin, made it much easier and faster to remove the seeds from the short staple cotton. A sturdy breed of cotton that could be grown in many different climates and soils in the South. Cotton growing breathed new life into the institution of enslavement. Enslavers looked for new lands to the west to expand cotton plantations. To help these land-hungry cotton planters, the United States government increasingly pressured Native Americans in the Deep South to give up their homelands. Native Americans in the southeastern United States, some of whom had adopted the practices of white colonizers, such as growing cotton and owning enslaved African Americans, resisted this pressure. The U.S. government eventually used a brutal policy of removal in which soldiers rounded up Native Americans, removed them from their land, and force marched or sailed them hundreds of miles to lands west of the Mississippi River. People of African descent enslaved by Native Americans were also forcibly moved west with their enslavers, and some Native Americans even purchased more enslaved people to take west with them. Thousands of Native Americans and an unknown number of enslaved African Americans died from disease and neglect along the way, and the removal process came to be known as the Trail of Tears. As white Southern cotton planters moved into Native homelands, the removal, death, and land theft suffered by Native Americans went hand in hand with the widespread enslavement and forced relocation of African Americans. Slavery in the new U.S. Constitution. Around the same time that the cotton gin took off, Southern enslaving states left a permanent mark on the American legal system by shaping the United States Constitution to meet their needs in upholding enslavement. During the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Southern pro-slavery representatives pushed for protections for enslavement, partly by threatening not to sign onto the new Constitution. A major protection for enslavement in the Constitution came in a clause that prohibited Congress from outlawing U.S. participation in the transatlantic slave trade for another 20 years. During those important 20 years, slave ships legally brought around 86,000 enslaved Africans to the United States. Congress was also required and given the power to use military force to stop insurrections and domestic violence, which would have included rebellions by enslaved people. Pro-slavery Southerners also ensured that the Constitution included a fugitive slave law, which required the return of enslaved people who sought freedom across state lines. The most important pro-slavery constitutional policy was the 3/5 clause. The Constitution was built on the idea of representative government and that Americans should elect people to represent their needs and interests in the federal government. In the U.S. House of Representatives, the number of representatives each state got was based on population, the idea that more populous states should get more representation than less populous states. This part of the Constitution raised controversial questions. Was it reasonable or fair for Southern states with large numbers of enslaved people to count those people toward their congressional representation when they allowed enslaved people no vote, no political rights, and very few legal rights? Question. If enslavers usually treated enslaved people as property, why should they suddenly be counted as people for purposes of representation? Question. People who opposed counting enslaved people toward congressional representation came mostly from the North, and they argued that the enslaved population should give little or no boost to Southern states' power. At the same time, enslavers demanded to count the enslaved people as whole people, not because they believed enslaved people were equal to white Americans, but because they wanted more voice in Congress and to counterbalance the power of the more populous northern state. The authors of the Constitution reached a compromise. States would get to count each enslaved person toward their representation in Congress, but each enslaved individual would only count as 3/5 or 60% of a free white person when it came to determine how many representatives each state received in the House. This was an enormous benefit for enslavers. They could continue to treat enslaved people as property, but still get to count 60% of the enslaved population toward getting more power in Congress. Representation in Congress also had a major influence on presidential elections. The Constitution set up the Electoral College, in which a group of representatives called electors vetoed to choose the next president. Each state got a number of electors equal to the number of senators and representatives that it had in Congress. In this way, enslaving states, which gained more representatives in Congress from the 3/5 clause, automatically gained more presidential electors and power to influence presidential elections too. At the same time, some historians argue that white Southerners would have gone even further to make the U.S. Constitution a pro-slavery document if they did not have to compromise with representatives from the northern states. The words slave and slavery could not be found anywhere in the new Constitution. Instead, it used code words for enslaved people such as person held to service or labor, or just other persons. Some historians see this as a sign that white Northerners who helped write the Constitution were growing less comfortable with enslavement and did not want the nation's founding document to say openly that owning human beings as property was legal. The Constitution also gave Congress the power to end U.S. participation in the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, rather than leaving it completely open, and the fugitive slave law was vague and not well enforced. Finally, 3/5 clause probably disappointed pro-slavery Southerners who pushed hard for enslaved people to be counted as whole people rather than as 60% of a person for purposes of representation in Congress. No matter what the Constitutional Convention intended to do, the new Constitution ended up giving pro-slavery Southerners outsized power in the federal government, strengthening the institution of enslavement. Northerners complained that the enslaving state 60% boost in congressional representation in the Electoral College, both due to the 3/5 clause, gave enslavers too much power over national politics. Some Northerners tried to get rid of the 3/5 clause. The linking of congressional representation to presidential electors also helped pro-slavery Southerners control the White House. Enslavers Thomas Jefferson in 1800 and James K. Polk in 1846 would not have won election to presidency without the South's extra electoral vote based on counting enslaved people. The power of pro-slavery white Southerners was evident throughout the United States early government. 50% of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers. Between George Washington's election in 1850, enslavers held the presidency for 50 years, the position of Speaker of the House for 41 years, and the chair of the House Representatives Ways and Means Committee for 42 years. Control of the presidency also meant control of the U.S. Supreme Court, where presidents chose justices to serve for life. Enslavers made up 18 of the 31 justices, or 58%, who sat on the U.S. Supreme Court before 1850. Ultimately, throughout American history, more than 1,700 congressmen representing 37 states once enslaved Black people. They did not only represent the South, but also every state in New England, much of the Midwest, and many Western states. Pro-slavery Southerners' control of Congress, the presidency, and the U.S. Supreme Court increased the lifespan of enslavement in the geographic area which it was legal. Together, pro-slavery officials in the federal government paved the way for enslavement's expansion into new states and territories in the West by letting enslavers move without regulation into the large geographic area south of the Ohio River. Between the ratification of the Constitution in 1788 and the start of the Civil War in 1861, Congress approved the creation of 9 new enslaving states, roughly 43% of all 21 new states. This expansion of enslavement included parts of the new territory of Louisiana, which the United States purchased from France in 1803. French Louisiana had long been an enslaving colony where sugar production based on enslaved labor was becoming a major source of wealth. Louisiana became a state in 1812, and by the time of the Civil War, produced 1/4 of the world's sugar and was the second richest state. In addition to creating this major new enslaving state, enslavers won another big victory in 1820 when Congress voted after protests by anti-slavery politicians to let Missouri become a state with a constitution that both allowed enslavement and banned free African Americans from settling. The major trade-off that opponents of enslavement got from the Missouri Compromise was a policy that enslavement would be illegal in all parts of the Louisiana Territory located north of Missouri's southern border. For the time being, white Americans reached an unsteady political peace over enslavement's westward expansion. The lives of enslaved people during the height of the domestic slave trade. Domestic trafficking of enslaved people. Cotton solidified enslavement important to the United States, especially in the Deep South where the crop grew the best. The demand for enslaved people in the Deep South allowed enslavers in the Upper South to profit from enslavement in a new way. The interstate trafficking of enslaved people. Enslavers on worn out tobacco farms in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia could not grow cotton themselves, but they could sell enslaved people to the growing cotton plantations farther south. Between 1790 and 1859, slave traders sold approximately 845,720 people within the United States. They made enormous fortunes in the trafficking of human beings, accounting to more than $159 million between 1820 and 1860. Slave traders marched or sailed hundreds of thousands of enslaved people to new territories along the Mississippi River or the Gulf of Mexico. Today's states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and later Texas were built on the brutal forced migration of the enslaved. The trafficking of enslaved people destroyed enslaved people's families, communities, and their bodies. Enslavers and slave traders often ambushed enslaved people with a surprise sale so that they could not attempt to run away or plead to stay with their family. The person, quote, sold south, end quote, was almost always separated from their family members and home communities forever. Parents and children, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, and extended family members and friends never saw each other again. On top of the grief and mental and emotional trauma of family separation come physical violence. Slave traffickers usually chain the hands and feet of enslaved people and then chain several individuals together in a line called a coffle. The traffickers marched their captives by gunpoint to the next place of sale. Newly purchased people might be added to the coffle along the way, or enslaved people might be sold to a string of different traders as they move south. Some enslaved people might make part of their forced journey via ship or riverboat. But it was common practice to march enslaved people hundreds of miles overland to their destination. Handcuffs and chains rubbed their skin raw. Their feet ached and bled, and they suffered from a lack of food, clothing, shelter, and sleep. Charles Ball, an enslaved man who was bought by slave traffickers, Maryland, and forced to march to South Carolina, later remembered, "I seriously meditated on self-destruction, and had I been at liberty to get a rope, I believe I should have hanged myself at Lancaster. I had now no hope of ever again seeing my wife and children, or of revisiting the scenes of my youth." At the time of their forced march south, enslaved people faced the terrifying process of being sold to the new enslavement. Many of the enslaved ended up in the city of New Orleans, the human trafficking center of the Deep South. Enslaved people waited until their day of sale in a high-walled outdoor yard called a slave pen, where they were crowded together with 50 to 100 people. Upon arrival, traffickers allowed enslaved people food, rest, baths, and new clothing to make them look more appealing to future buyers and bring a higher price upon sale. Later, traders who trafficked in enslaved people sold them in a showroom next to the pen. As historian Walter Johnson has written, one of the great obscenities of enslavement was that enslavers forced enslaved people to perform their own commodification. Slave traders coached enslaved people on how to act and what to say to potential buyers, to hide any injuries or disabilities, and to highlight their valuable skills. When sales began, enslaved people were required to line up by gender and height, separate from any family member. Buyers questioned and examined them, forcing them to open their mouths to show their teeth and to undress to reveal any signs of illness, disability, disease, or scars from previous whippings, which whites saw as signs of disobedience. Enslaved people with specialized skills, such as the ability to play a musical instrument, might perform for buyers, while slave traders forced everyone to parade around and dance to show their physical well-being. Women and girls often suffered the most violent inspections of their bodies. Buyers took them behind closed doors, stripped them naked, and forcibly examined their breasts and genitals to see if they would be good breeders and were free of sexually transmitted disease. The moment of sale was extremely painful and traumatic. Buyers purchased enslaved people based on racist stereotypes about African Americans' capabilities and skills, which were often connected to skin color, gender, and physical size. Younger enslaved black men and women, as well as teenagers, often sold at high prices as prime field hands to pick cotton and do other hard labor. Enslaved men's skills, such as carpentry, barrel making, or driving carts, also sold for higher prices. Enslavers often bought younger enslaved women to work in the cotton fields, but also valued the knowledge and skills in home-based work such as cooking, washing clothes, sewing, cleaning, and childcare. Finally, elderly people and very young children usually were sold for a lot less money because white buyers viewed their labor and skills as less valuable. Some buyers specifically bought black people that they could subject to sexual and reproductive violence. The fancy trade was the term for selling young women and girls to white men for the purpose of constant rape and or forced sex work in brothels. Other enslavers bought young mothers with or without their children because a woman who had recently given birth to children showed that she was able to have more children in the future to enrich her buyer. Pregnant and breastfeeding women could be forced to nurse all the children, black and white, on a plantation to free up other enslaved mothers for field work. All of these factors often meant that even if an enslaved family had managed to stay together up to this point, they would now face permanent separation. Solomon Northup, a free black man from New York, who was kidnapped and sold into enslavement, remembered the case of an enslaved woman named Eliza. Eliza begged to be sold with her 2 children, Emily, who was 7 or 8 years old, and Randall, who was 4 to 5 years old. Slave traders sold off Randall to another buyer and refused to sell Emily to Eliza's buyer because they hoped to sell the tiny girl as a fancy to a wealthy enslaver when she was a little older. Northup wrote that the sale of her children was absolutely soul-crushing for Eliza. She died young from the grief of losing them. Pause. May she rest in peace. Cotton and capitalism. Enslavers were capitalists, and like all capitalists, they strived for profit maximization. They wanted to get the most work out of enslaved people by pushing them to, but not beyond, their physical breaking point. To do this, enslavers used violence or the threat of violence to make the enslaved work harder and faster and to maintain a constant, carefully calculated rate of production. The result for enslaved people was a nearly endless daily round of work under the constant threat of violence. Once enslaved people were sold to the Deep South, their new enslavers subjected them to a lifetime of brutal, back-breaking work growing cotton, which was a never-ending year-round process. Enslaved people began every spring by plowing the land and planting cotton seeds. For the next several months, they hoed the fields to kill grass and weeds that might damage the fragile young cotton plant. Starting in August, enslaved people worked from sunup to sundown to pick cotton, sometimes working by the light of the moon to finish. They only stopped for a 10 to 15-minute meal break per day. This exhausting work day did not end when the cotton picking was done. Everyone still had to cut wood, feed farm animals, and do all of the other daily tasks that kept the plantation running. Then, enslaved people went back to their cabins, made their evening meals, and cooked food to eat in the cotton fields the next day. The cotton picking season went on for months into the winter. After the cotton season ended, enslaved people harvested the corn crop, which, according to Solomon Northup, was used for fattening hogs and feeding slaves. After the corn harvest was complete, enslaved people burned all the dead corn and cotton plants and began the process of planting the next year's crops all over again. To make sure that enslaved people worked as hard and as quickly as possible, enslavers came up with the pushing system. The main idea behind the pushing system was that every enslaved person should farm a certain number of acres of cotton per year. This number kept increasing from 5 acres per enslaved person in 1805, double that number, 10 acres by the 1850s. In fact, many of today's financial accounting and scientific management practices to increase profits had their early beginnings amongst enslavers in the U.S. South and the Caribbean who wanted to perfect the pushing system. To make sure that the production of cotton and profits kept increasing, enslavers intensified the physical violence. Frederick Douglass remembered that sleep-deprived enslaved people who accidentally slept past sunrise were whipped for lateness. Solomon Northup, a free black man kidnapped and sold into enslavement in Louisiana, remembered that enslavers followed enslaved people into the fields on horseback and whipped them if they stopped work or fell behind. He also remembered that each adult was responsible for picking 200 pounds of cotton per day, and that those who did not pick enough got whipped. Even picking less than one's own personal best daily weight record or accidentally breaking a branch on a cotton plant resulted in whipping. Northup himself was whipped for failing to pick cotton fast enough when he was sick and exhausted. Southern slaves' codes, the state and local laws, that enforced enslavement became more severe to support the increased brutality and profitability of enslavement, especially in the Deep South. Many southern states outlawed all meetings of enslaved people, including religious observance, without supervision by white people, prohibited teaching enslaved people to read and write, and banned enslaved people from trading. These laws also increased slave patrols, the police forces that enforced these laws. Finally, new laws made it much more difficult for enslaved people to achieve their freedom by banning manumission, voluntary emancipation by enslavers. Altogether, these developments in slave codes aim to maintain a racial caste system by cracking down on all resistance by enslaved people and to prevent them from ever getting their freedom, neglect, and violence. Living conditions for enslaved people showed enslavers' inhumane, brutal emphasis on profit maximization. Most of the enslaved lived in small, poorly built cabins. Gaps between the log walls were so big that the wind and rain constantly blew in. Furniture was either rare or non-existent. Solomon Northup's bed was a plank of wood, 12 inches wide and 10 feet long. Frederick Douglass reported that enslaved people on the Maryland tobacco plantation, where he was born, had no beds at all. They slept on a cold dirt floor with only a rough blanket. On the coldest nights, the young Douglass would steal a sack used for carrying corn and slept inside it with his head inside and his feet hanging out. Years later, when he wrote about his life, he remembered that my feet have been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes. Besides cold, one of the greatest things Douglass suffered was hunger. Douglass's enslaver had enslaved children mashed up boiled corn in a trough on the ground. The children were then forced to eat like so many pigs, and he that ate fastest got most. Solomon Northup remembered a similar lack of food on the Louisiana plantation where he lived for 10 years. Each person received only 3.5 pounds of bacon and a peck of corn, about 8 dry quarts per week. Enslaved people, particularly women and girls, also suffered sexual and reproductive violence. Enslavers frequently raped and impregnated enslaved women and girls and increased their profits by doing so. Frederick Douglass pointed out that since children born to enslaved women were automatically enslaved at birth, enslavers often owned and sold their own children as property. Additionally, Douglass remembered that white women often harassed enslaved victims of rape and their mixed-race children by insisting on their sale or punishing them even more cruelly than other enslaved people. Enslavers also forced sexual intercourse between enslaved people. An act historian Dana Ramey Berry has called third-party rape so that they could breed more children to make more money. Frederick Douglass remembered that a poor white farmer named Edward Covey owned only one enslaved woman named Caroline and had to rent additional enslaved people from others, a practice called hiring out. To increase his own wealth, Covey forced Caroline and one of the rented enslaved men who was already married to have sex. Not long after, Caroline gave birth to twins. Douglass remembered that the children were regarded as being quite in addition to his wealth. Sexual violence tripled Covey's wealth from 1 to 3 enslaved people within just 1 year. Finally, enslavers also used the bodies of enslaved people, living and deceased, for medical and scientific experimentation. For an in-depth discussion of medical experimentation on enslaved people in African America throughout U.S. history, see please Chapter 12, Mental and Physical Harm and Neglect. Enslaved communities and cultures, resilience, resistance, and rebellion. Enslaved people of African descent defied enslavers' efforts to dehumanize them by creating resilient families and communities, vibrant cultures, and distinctive religious and intellectual traditions. Family ties, community ties, cultural practices, and religious traditions ensured African American survival. They were the foundation of Black resistance to enslavement and the struggle for human rights both before emancipation and long afterward. Family life was the building block of enslaved life in the American South. Although enslaved families were always in danger of being broken apart by sale, enslaved people built strong extended family ties and fought to preserve these relationships. Husbands and wives struggled to have enslavers recognize their marriage ties by claiming their right to live together in their own private cabins or to visit spouses who lived on different plantations. Enslaved parents chose their children's names to honor their own family ties, not according to the will of their enslavers, and frequently named children after grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Enslaved people often chose their own last names, even if enslavers refused to recognize them, and they passed down their skills to their children. Enslaved people also rebelled against the sale of their family members, sometimes by fleeing to see their relatives on distant plantations. Enslaved people built close communities bound together by blood, marriage, and adoptive family ties. On larger plantations, multiple extended family groups lived in the same slave headquarters and were often linked to each other through marriage or adoptive kin relations. For instance, Frederick Douglass remembered that the enslaved children on the Maryland plantation, where he was born, referred to older enslaved men as their uncles, demonstrating both their respect for the elders and the close family-like relationship that grew between community members unrelated by blood. These close ties can best be seen in case of young enslaved children orphaned by the sale or death of their parents. Extended family members and non-kin alike frequently raise these children along with their own children. Close-knit families and communities ensured that cultural practices, language, and oral histories were passed down to the next generation. Slave quarters, the clusters of cabins where the enslaved lived, were often distant from the big house of the enslavers and allowed the enslaved some privacy to pray, dance, sing, tell stories, rest, and tend to their home. The lively cultural spaces that enslaved people created for themselves allowed for the persistence of elements of African language, music, medicine, and storytelling in African American culture across generations. Religious life was often the heart of family and community experience for enslaved people, creating spaces for freedom of expression, cultural resilience, and resistance. Enslaved people who were stolen from Africa continued the spiritual practices of their homelands, whether indigenous West African religions or Islam. Over time, enslaved communities fused elements of African religious practice, including song, dance, call and response, and healing practices with Protestant Christianity. They created a distinctive American religious culture that taught a message of liberation, a gospel of freedom. Enslaved preachers emphasized freedom from enslavement both in the afterlife and on earth. They focused on biblical liberation stories such as Moses leading the Israelites out of the bondage in Egypt, as well as stories that emphasize the power of the weak to defeat the mighty, such as David and Goliath. Enslavers tried to suppress this religious expression by prohibiting religious gatherings or by emphasizing parts of the Bible that said that servants should obey their masters. Still, enslaved people resisted these efforts by meeting in secret to worship. As a formerly enslaved woman named Alice Sewell remembered, we used to slip off in the woods in the old slave days on Sunday evening, way down in the swamps, to sing and pray to our own liking. We prayed for this day of freedom. We come from 4 and 5 miles to pray together to God. And if we didn't live to see it, to please let our children live to see a better day and be free. As Alice Sewell's memory shows, religious and community life became a foundation for enslaved people's resistance to the brutal and dehumanizing conditions of their enslavement. In some cases, religious and community ties catalyzed outright rebellions against enslavement. The alleged Denmark Vesey conspiracy in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822, and the Nat Turner Rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831, Ashe, developed among communities of free and enslaved African Americans who believed strongly in the gospel of freedom. Most often, though, enslaved communities, cultures, and spiritual beliefs made possible smaller forms of everyday resistance that pushed back against the relentless work and violence of enslavement. Enslaved people slowed down work, broke tools, or temporarily escaped to avoid abuse or brutal working conditions. Everyday resistance forced enslavers to recognize enslaved people's humanity and showed their deep longings to be free. Ultimately, enslaved people in the United States created a distinctive American Black culture that was different from ancestral African cultures, white European cultures, or African diaspora cultures elsewhere in the world. Distinctive African American artistic expression, especially music and dance, literary and linguistic styles, and culinary innovations, among many other practices, will shape mainstream American culture across centuries. For a detailed discussion of African American culture and artistic impact on the United States, see Chapter 9, Control over Spiritual, Creative, and Cultural Life. Northern complicity in enslavement. White New Englanders, the slave trade, and the textile industry. Although enslavement itself was disappearing in the North, white Northerners' participation in enslavement grew along with the Southern cotton economy. White people in New England, for instance, profited from the transatlantic traffic in enslaved African rum manufacturing and cotton textile production. White Northerners had been involved in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved people for a long time as shipping company owners, slave ship captains, and slave traders. For example, businessmen from the northern state of Rhode Island controlled most of the trade in captive human beings. Slaving ships from Rhode Island brought rum to the coast of West Africa and traded barrels of liquor for enslaved people, who they trafficked to North America. Around 24 rum distilleries in the town of Newport, Rhode Island, fed this profitable trade. By the time of the American Revolution, these Rhode Island merchants controlled 2/3 of the entire transatlantic slave trade in the 13 colonies, and they held onto the control after U.S. independence. When adding together, white Rhode Islanders were responsible for bringing 100,000 enslaved Africans to North America. 15,000 of these enslaved people were captives from Rhode Island, enslavers rushed to bring into the United States before Congress outlawed participation in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved people in 1808. At the same time, textile mills, the factories which processed southern cotton into cloth, were the basis of early northern industrial growth. Cotton grown by enslaved people in the United States. South fed these mills, and the mills employed thousands of people across New England. By the time of the Civil War in 1861, New Englanders had invested more than $69 million in cotton fabric production and operated 570 separate mills. Over 81,000 Americans worked in the New England textile mills, and the total profits amounted to over $79 million per year. Slavery and the economic power of New York City. New York City is a strong example of how Northerners participated in and profited from enslavement. Captive Africans enslaved by the Dutch West Indian Company were part of the labor force that constructed the early walled street that eventually became Wall Street, the economic center of the United States. Later, the street became the city's first slave market. Let me repeat. Later, the street became the city's first slave market. City leaders decided in 1711 that whites who wanted to rent out enslaved Black or Native American people could only do so at the end of Wall Street next to the East River. Enslaved people became less and less common in the city after the state of New York passed a law in 1799 that gradually freed children born to enslaved mothers and then outlawed enslavement completely in 1817. But as enslavement itself was dying out, white New Yorkers were building strong economic ties to Southern enslavement that brought millions of dollars in profit every year. New York City was the main destination of Southern cotton and the center of the transatlantic cotton trade. New York-based shipping companies gathered the cotton in southern cities and took it north to New York City, where merchants packed it and shipped it to Europe. New York City was also the banking center of the United States, and New York banks helped finance the expansion of enslavement in the South. Banks loaned money to enslavers to buy more land and more enslaved people. Banks also accepted enslaved people as security for those loans, which meant that they could take and sell enslaved people if the enslavers failed to pay back their debts. For example, in 2005, J.P. Morgan Chase, the banking giant, wrote a formal apology because two banks that it now owned had taken 13,000 enslaved people as security for loans in the state of Louisiana. When enslavers could not pay back the loans, the banks ended up taking ownership of 1,250 of those people and then most probably sold them. New York City was also strongly connected to Southern enslavement through the insurance industry. Insurance companies insured the lives of enslaved and paid enslavers if an enslaved person died. Some insurance companies also insured shipments of trafficked enslaved people sold within the United States. Some of these companies were the early ancestors of today's most important insurance companies, including New York Life, U.S. Life, and Aetna. American insurance companies' investments and complicity in enslavement was so widespread that the California government required all insurers who did business in the state to make their records of participation in enslavement open to the public. Corporate manufacturing profits. A variety of New York businesses also profited from processing and manufacturing agricultural products grown by enslaved people into goods for consumers to buy. Brooks Brothers, still a well-known New York City clothing company, made money from enslavement in multiple ways. The company made fashionable, expensive clothing woven from southern cotton grown by enslaved people. It also profited from making cheap clothing that enslavers bought to dress enslaved people. At the same time, sugar refineries, factories which processed raw sugar into a usable form, became a major New York industry, especially in the borough of Brooklyn. These factories processed thousands of pounds of raw sugar grown by enslaved people in Louisiana and Cuba. By 1855, 15 New York City refineries were producing over 12 million of sugar per year. The profits of sugar refining can still be seen in New York City today. Columbia University's Havmeyer Hall was funded by and named after one of the city's most important sugar refining families from the 1800s, whose business relied on sugar grown by enslaved people. The Havmeyer family built what was once the largest sugar refining factory in the world, the Domino Sugar Refinery, which still stands beside East River in Brooklyn. Although the Brooklyn location is no longer running, the Domino Sugar brand, now owned by the ASR Group, continues to be processed in factories in New York, Maryland, and Louisiana. The legacies of enslavement in the sugar industry continue in the present day. After the Civil War and the end of enslavement, southern states such as Texas and Louisiana rented out imprisoned African Americans to white sugarcane farmers. Many died in the brutal sugar production process. The Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola and the Texas State Penitentiary at Sugar Land also supported themselves and profited these state governments by growing and processing sugarcane on the prison grounds. Incarcerated individuals at Angola continue to process sugar to sell in the prison gift shop as recently as 2014. Slavery and American institutions. Historically white universities and religious organizations. A wide range of U.S. colleges and universities, both private and public, profited from enslavement or ties to enslavers, while at the same time denying admission to African Americans for most of the nation's history. Almost all Ivy League universities and colleges can be included in this category. Harvard University Law School was created in 1817 and funded largely by land donations from a wealthy merchant named Isaac Royal, Jr. Royal, who was the son of a human trafficker and enslaved people. Owned multiple sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Latin America that were worked by enslaved people. Other early Harvard donors made their money by trading enslaved people or goods produced by enslaved people in the Caribbean, smuggling enslaved Africans into the United States after Congress banned American participation in transatlantic slave trade in 1808. or running textile mills fed by Southern cotton. The wealth of Brown University, formerly known as College of Rhode Island, was greatly tied to the human trafficking activities of its home state, Rhode Island. Members of the Brown family, early donors after whom the university is named, owned enslaved people and participated in the transatlantic slave trade. University Hall, the oldest building on the Brown University campus, was partially built by enslaved people and made of wood donated by one of the state's largest slave trading companies. South Carolina slave traffickers and enslavers also gave money to help fund the college. Other Ivy League schools have similar connections to enslavement. The University of Pennsylvania, Princeton University, Columbia University, Yale University, and Dartmouth College count enslavers, slave traffickers, and or post-slavery defenders among their early donors, founders, trustees, administrators, building namesakes, faculty, students, and alumni. Enslavement was also strongly linked to religious life and religious organizations in colonial America and the early United States. Some churches and religious colleges owned, bought, and sold enslaved people. In the southern enslaving states, some churches raised money to buy enslaved people. Anglican and Episcopalian churches in Virginia during the 1600s and 1700s attracted new ministers by allowing them use of church-owned enslaved people. Some wealthy churchgoers donated enslaved people to churches so that the profits of their labor could be used to fund free schools for poor white children. In the 1700s and 1800s, many Virginia Presbyterian churches hired out enslaved people so that they could use the profits to pay ministers and fund church upkeep. Colleges with religious missions also owned and profited from enslaved people. Virginia's College of William and Mary, which was originally an Anglican college to train new ministers, started owning enslaved people around 1704. Enslaved people worked in the college kitchens, dormitories, laundries, stables, and gardens, or in the college-owned tobacco plantation, or raised money for student scholarships. Although the college sold off many enslaved people during the American Revolution to pay off its debts, tearing them away from their families and communities, enslavement continued on the William and Mary campus until during the Civil War. Some colleges run by the Society of Jesus, a Catholic religious group better known as the Jesuits, also depended on the lives and labor of the enslaved. The Jesuits, who operated Georgetown College, now Georgetown University, owned plantations and hundreds of enslaved people. The profits of these plantations funded the school. In 1838, when the college was struggling due to the lack of funding, Jesuits sold 272 enslaved black people to Deep South plantations so that they could pay off the school's debts. Even though Jesuit leaders in Rome required that the enslaved people be kept together as families and given Catholic religious education in their new homes, buyers in Louisiana failed to keep these promises. Altogether, the mass sale of elders, women, men, children, and infants raised $115,000, equal to around $3.3 million in 2016, to fund Georgetown College University. Direct federal government investment and participation. Finally, the federal government directly invested in, protected, and profited from the enslavement of African Americans. The early U.S. national banking system played an important role in funding the expansion of cotton grown and the interstate slave trade. For example, in the years 1831 to 1832, the Second Bank of the United States, the private bank that the United States used to handle all of the federal government's banking needs, gave 5% of all its loans to just one slave trading company in New Orleans. By 1861, just under 2% of the entire budget of the United States went to pay for expenses related to enslavement. These expenses included dealing with the illegal transatlantic slave trade, colonization projects to remove formerly enslaved people from the United States and settle them in other parts of the world, enforcing fugitive slave laws, and renting enslaved people to build federal military sites in the South. The U.S. federal government also actively participated in upholding enslavement because it directly controlled the nation's capital at Washington, D.C. The District of Columbia was formed from lands that once belonged to the two enslaving states of Maryland and Virginia. As a result of this, Washington, D.C. had to carry over the laws of those states, including laws supporting enslavement. U.S. courts in Washington, D.C. took direct responsibility for punishing enslaved people and deciding cases involving the buying, selling, and inheritance of enslaved people. Since there were no laws against moving enslaved people through D.C., and because D.C. was centrally located in the Upper South, the area also became an important location in the interstate slave trade. Slave traffickers gathered and imprisoned enslaved people in D.C. slave pens, quote unquote, where they waited to be moved to the Deep South and sold. Solomon Northup, a free black man who was kidnapped and sold into enslavement in 1841, remember that he waited to be sold south in a slave pen within the very shadow of the Capitol. That U.S. Capitol building, along with another major national landmark and some symbol of democracy, the White House, was particularly built by the labor of enslaved people. I want to say that one more time. Along with the U.S. Capitol building, along with another major national landmark and symbol of democracy, the White House. Yeah, family. Along with another major national landmark and symbol of democracy, the White House was particularly built by the labor of enslaved people. Man, this is so deep, family. Yeah, this one was a hard one to get through. I think we're going to just stop right there. Thanks to everyone for coming on this last one in the building. And next time we're going to do part 2. And we're going to get into enslavement in California. So that's going to be part 2. God willing, we'll be here tomorrow to read this wonderful yet tragic, unfortunate, situation that our ancestors had to go through, and that we're carrying a remnant of that. But we're here to change that best way that we possibly can. So, thanks again, once family, coming through. Appreciate you on that level, family. Love and reparations. And until next time, y'all have a wonderful night. And for those on the replay, please like, share, subscribe, and keep supporting the channel. Keep doing this. All right, family. Have a good night.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, but I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.